Hello guys, this video is a different video than the previous one which I've done on Veeam. In this, we will be exploring more on the Veeam Multi-Cloud Mobility option. So as you can see in this particular screen, this is a screen where it shows if you take a backup in Veeam, say for example, you take it in vSphere, you can restore that backup on Hyper-V, Nutanix, Azure, AWS, and Google. So this is kind of a compatibility metrics. So whatever your source may be, you can have it restored in different hyperscaler, different hypervisor. So today, I'm going to explore more on this to check how things work. So I have a demo setup. I will explain you how my demo is done because it includes multi-cloud plus multi-hypervisor on-prem. And I also use a Veeam free edition on Azure to do backup of restored VMs. So it's kind of like I've touched base with quite a few things. It took a lot of time for me to put this together, but let's begin. Now, I also wanted to show, the next slide, which is Scale-out Backup Repository. So in my demo, I have used this option. So basically, what is a Scale-out Backup Repository in Veeam? You kind of club your performance tier, capacity tier, archive tier to form a single group or a cluster. So when I say performance tier, this is basically your on-prem, the local storage of your Veeam backup. So why it's called performance? Because it's in-house within your same LAN. The performance is good, and it's going to be, a powerful backup server with SSDs or hard disks. Now, in Scale-out Backup Repository, which I will show to you in lab, I have the performance tier. I have also included a capacity tier. So capacity tier is one level above like performance tier. It can be your object-based storage like Azure Blob, AWS S3, and we can create some policies. Say, for example, as soon as a backup is taken on your performance tier, which is your local backup repository, it can move immediately to a capacity tier. So in this, what you're trying to do is you're keeping one copy locally and one copy on cloud elsewhere. And you also have an option to configure archive tier. So archive tier is meant for more long-term, a backup repository, like for audit purpose. I in this demo I haven't used the archive tier. The reason being, if you put something in archive tier, you have to maintain those basic things like keeping this online or the keeping the data for a certain amount of time. Or if you take it out, then you have to pay for more cost, and there is high retrieval charges when you take out data from archival tier. Right now, let's go and talk about my demo environment setup. Okay. So I have put step by step like what I'm planning to do here. First, I'll show this and I will show it in my live environment as well. I have a Veeam backup and repository installed, which is the latest version enterprise edition where you get the 30 days trial. So I've been use that. And I've also configured a scale-out backup repository to hold the backup of my virtual machine locally. And also in this demo, I have used Azure Blob as my capacity tier. So as soon as there is a backup done, there will be a local copy and another copy will be tiered to my Azure Blob, right? So where am I taking the backup from? First thing, step 0, I am taking a backup of Windows XP VM from Hyper-V. So this is my Hyper-V infrastructure. There is a Windows XP VM running, and that will be backed up to my Veeam Scale-out Backup Repository as a step 0. Step 1, I will restore that VM in VMware infrastructure. So as you can see from Hyper-V platform, I am restoring the VM in vCenter, which is your VMware platform. So the disk will automatically get converted by the Veeam from VHDX to VMDK. And then as step 2, I will also restore this VM on Azure. So which means it is getting converted to the native Azure format as well. And step 3, since we are restoring some VM elsewhere, say for example a DR drill or something went wrong and you are running the VM on cloud, and people are accessing and doing some changes. So you need to record those changes as a backup elsewhere, right? So I'm using Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure Free Edition to back up the restored VM on Azure. So I will show about this as well. Finally, I'll be restoring the Windows XP VM in AWS Cloud. So this is truly a multi-cloud mobility, backup and restore solution. Let's see it in action. Yeah. So where I am right now is my jump host. So I have my VMware infrastructure, my Azure infra, and then my AWS, and then my Veeam. This is the Veeam which I'm talking about, the backup for Azure, the free edition. I wanted to actually show everything step by step, but then that will become a detailed video like configuring the AWS cloud or the Azure cloud or installing this. But I'll try to walk through a few steps on how things are done. Right now, let's explore my Veeam infrastructure. So this is my Veeam host. And what I've got here is a simple one. As you can see, it's an enterprise plus edition. And I have like 21 days left. It's version 12.0. So first thing, if I go to my inventory, I've added my vSphere environment. So my vSphere environment is here and my Hyper-V environment is here. So these are my virtual infrastructure, which has been added to Veeam for taking backup. Now, if I go to backup infrastructure, as you can see here in backup repository, I have the default backup repository, and then these two are local backup repository. Whenever I say like performance tier, imagine it is the local backup repository. So this one is my performance tier, which is my local backup, and I've also configured the capacity tier, which is the Azure Blob storage. And it's pretty simple. All you need to do is come to backup repository, click on add, and choose what kind of repository you're adding. In this case, I added if for example I'm going to add Azure or AWS S3, I go to object storage and pick that and fill in few details like what's your account and everything. There are some videos online, or the article from Veeam is very clear on how to do it. So all I did is I came to backup repository. I added like one performance tier, one capacity tier. So why I named it like performance and capacity, just to align with like the terms used here, right? So performance tier is the local one. Capacity tier is going to be our object-based storage. So that's why I named it so it matches the flow. So once the capacity or performance tier is added, you come back to Scaleout repository, you right click and you add a Scaleout repository. So in this, as I said, it's just like you're including your capacity and performance tier together to form kind of a cluster, right? So all I'm doing is from here, I took my Azure Blob and I took my performance tier from here, the local one, and I kind of created a Scaleout backup repository. Now, if we go to properties of this, we can see my performance tier is the one which I added, the local. And if I go to the placement, I've used the data locality as the placement. And the capacity tier is my Azure Blob, which I've added. And I've also chosen this option, copy backup to object as soon as they are created, which means as soon as a backup job is initiated, and if there is a copy of that backup in my local performance tier, immediately there will be a copy triggered to my object-based storage. You can also set like, imagine you're setting up the Scale-out Backup Repository later, and you have like older backup which needs to be moved. You can set like my backups which are more than 14 days can be moved to the object storage. And in archive, I haven't added an archive, the reasons whatever I said previously. So it's very simple to configure a Scale-out backup repository with some policy like backup immediately or something, right? Okay, so this is the infrastructure. So just to recap, I have a vSphere, I have an Hyper-V, and then I have a backup repository where I have one performance tier, capacity tier, and I've put those things in a Scale-out backup repository. Perfect. So let me also show you my Hyper-V infrastructure. So if we go to Hyper-V, this is my Hyper-V infrastructure, a very basic standalone one. I have like 3 VMs and I'm backing up the Windows XP. Now, Windows XP, the reason is it's very small VM and it's easy to back up. It's just about 2 gigs, so the demo time also can be reduced. I wanted to do the Linux, which is even more smaller, but then when you restore a Linux on Azure native, you also need to set up, a temporary VM. To do all these things, there is some additional cost on cloud. So I thought better I'll go with Windows XP, right? So now I'll start my backup job to back up this Windows XP as a step 0, what I mentioned. I'm backing up my Windows XP from my Hyper-V infrastructure. So I go back to my V and then I go home, jobs. So this is a backup job which I already created. So it's a pretty straightforward one. I just gave a backup job name and I chose Windows XP, right? And then all the here the important thing is where do you want to store the VM. So here, instead of choosing the independent the local backup repository, I've chosen Scale-out Backup Repository. So that's when we can clearly see how the backup is stored locally and how it's getting cleared to Azure Blob also, right? So it's a basic backup policy, and then I will start this. Right, so as soon as we start, the job is starting and I go to the running. I see it's because it's Windows XP, it should not take more time. I believe it will take less than like 5-10 minutes. You see, so the VM size, the disk what I allocated for Windows XP is 20 gig, but the overall used space of it is 2.3 gig. And the first step when we okay, this is going to be a little quick because yesterday I triggered full backup, so right now it's going to be just the incremental backup. Nevertheless, I will show you like how this gets copied and how it gets tiered to Blob as well. We just need to wait for this to complete, and then there will be one more task triggered by Veeam automatically. So let me pause this video for a while until this gets completed. Right, guys, so as you see, right, it just took about 2 minutes and then the backup is completed. Now, even though backup is completed, you can see one more running task. So this is what I was talking about, right? Because the backup completed on the local performance tier. Now, what is happening is this backup, which was completed in the local tier, it is immediately getting pushed to my Azure Blob because my Azure Blob is part of my the Scale-out Backup Repository. So that's my capacity tier. So as soon as there is a backup which is done locally, and it will start tiering the backup to my Azure Blob storage. So that is what is happening here. You can see the name SOBR tiering, and this one is going to my Azure Blob. So this usually takes a little time. The reason is it has to push to cloud the Azure Blob storage, right? So since the data size is not big, it's around 2.3 gig. It should not take more than like 4 or 5 minutes, depending upon the upload speed. But then let me pause this video and get back once it's done. Right. So it took roughly around 4 minutes to push this backup to Azure Blob storage. You can see it took around 4 minutes to complete, and offload is done. Okay. So how do we validate that? If you go to the backups under the jobs, right, you can see there is one copy of my Windows XP. This is in the local performance tier, and in the capacity tier, there is one more copy of Windows XP, which is in the Azure Blob storage. So if we go back to our diagram on what we wanted to do, right? So we have completed the step 0 where we took backup of the Windows XP and stored it in Veeam Scale-out Backup Repository. And from there, the backup has been pushed to the Azure Blob, and also we have one local backup copy, right? The next step is to restore this backup on a VMware infrastructure. So basically, I'm trying to convert the VM from Hyper-V format to VMware infrastructure. For this, I have two options to choose. Either I can go to this capacity tier, right click and do a recovery from here to vSphere. But then since this is coming out of cloud, there will be definitely the egress charges. So anything into cloud is free, anything out of cloud is chargeable, right? So I don't want to do that. So instead I use my local performance tier. I right click and I go with first the quick option, which is instant recovery. So I go to VMware vSphere and I just follow the wizard to restore this VM, right? So here I just need to choose my VMware infrastructure, where exactly I want to place the VM. And I can give a name also here like vSphere restore and VM folder as well. I can choose what I need. And then the network, I can choose what network I want this VM to be placed, right? And then next, I can just go with the default options. So this is another good option from Veeam, right? Where you have something called secure restore. Just in case you were under ransomware attack and you want to validate if your backup is genuine before doing the restore. If your Veeam local machine has any kind of antivirus software, right? We can use that to scan the backup first before going and restoring. So I'm going to skip this option. Can give a message what is this, and yeah, so basically I'm just restoring the VM from the backup to VMware infrastructure. So if I go back to my, okay, let's wait for a while and then we can see it live in the VMware infrastructure. Okay, meanwhile, while I'm doing this, I will also trigger a restore in Azure because this restore operations usually take some time. So let me go to my capacity tier now because this is already in Azure. There is one copy of my backup of Windows XP in Azure, right? So I'm going to use that one to do a restore in Azure, which is going to be much more quicker. So very simple, right click on the capacity tier, the Windows XP, and just say restore to Microsoft Azure, right? When you do it for the first time, it'll ask you to add, the account. In my case, I've already added the subscription where I want to restore, and then just choose some basic options like proxy. This proxy is nothing but my Veeam server itself, right? Now, this is the reason why I didn't want to go for Linux VM, because if you're restoring Linux, you need a helper appliance which needs to be deployed on cloud, and that's kind of an additional charge as well. So in my case, it's Windows XP. So I say no, I go next. All right. And here I can change my VM name. So I can just call it as Azure Restore. Okay. And go next. And yeah, this is important. You need to choose what kind of instance you want to use to restore this VM. Cloud, we get all this instance, right? So in my case, I go with a small instance like B2 small with this 2 core and 4 CPU, right? So make sure this instance, whatever you're choosing, is available in the region where you're trying to restore it. Then, which is the resource group. So folks who have worked on, Azure, they would know like what is this resource group. That's just a folder where all your stuff resides. And what is your virtual network? So these all has to be pre-created, which I've already created a VNet. I've already created a subnet. I don't want to assign a public, so I just go next. And then again, we have the secure restore option, which I said, like if you want to first scan it locally before you restore, we can do that. I don't want to, I just go next. So this is your summary that your VM is getting restored in this resource group, this is the VNet, this is the subnet, and this is the instant type what we're using, and this is the name of the machine, and power on in the target. Okay, finish. So now we triggered two jobs. One, restore to Azure. The other one is restore to vSphere. So our vSphere restore is completed and it's waiting on a stage for user to start migration. So if you guys have worked on Veeam instant recovery option, right? You would know like what is actually instant recovery. So if I go to my vSphere infrastructure, this is the folder, and you can see here my VM is restored. Now, when I say instant recovery, right, it is from the Veeam backup server itself. From the Veeam backup server, there is an NFS created and mounted in your VMware infrastructure, and from there the VM is hosted. Why we use this option is we first restore, we check if everything looks good. If everything looks good, then we move it to production, right? So in my case, okay, I saw the VM is restored and it's connected, everything is working fine. So what I do is I go back to Veeam and I go to the instant recovery option. I say, yes, I'm happy with this restore. So let's move it to production. So basically what you're trying to do is you're moving it to a data store, which is not from your Veeam local. So if you go back here right now, you can see this one is from your Veeam backup. Just remember this. Now, what I'm trying to do is I'm just triggering a move to production visit where it says this VM will go to vSAN data store. So of course, that's the data store which I want to move it. So if I go and see the summary page, right, it will clearly say what exactly has been done so far. Let's wait for this to complete. Okay, so basically what it says is we are just doing a storage vMotion on the same host. I'm not changing the compute, but I'm changing it from the local data store of Veeam to vSAN data store. Okay, and if you want to delete the VM, the source one, I don't want to do, and I just say finish. So this one is basically calling the API to do a storage vMotion on VMware infrastructure. So we can see that in live. If I minimize this, if we go to this VM monitor and then tasks, you would see a task which will trigger now, which is basically trying to migrate this VM to vSAN data store. So it should start any minute now, unless there is no error seen here. Okay, processing VM restore. Okay, I don't see any error so far, so it's good. All right, so you can see here it's doing a relocate. So it's relocating from the Veeam local NFS as a temporary to the actual vSAN, so that we can conclude that the vSphere restore is completed. So we give just some time. It usually takes 2 or 3 minutes to do the storage vMotion. So now let's go back to our Veeam. And yeah, so let this go on. Let's go see our Azure restore, what's happening with Azure. So it is 5% completed. All right, so it is in progress. It is restoring almost like 1 GB has been restored. As I said, it's around 2.3 gig, right? The Windows XP. So maybe another 4 or 5 minutes. I think the data should have been completely copied to Azure. I mean, it's already in Azure because we are restoring from Azure Blob to Azure, but there is some conversion process in between. All those things has to be done. So we just give this some more time, and let's go and check our vSphere migration, how far it is done. So it is around 42%. Okay. So if we go to vSphere, yeah. So basically it is getting the percentage from here, like what's the progress made. So while we are waiting, let's go do this. So step one, we did the backup, that's completed. Step two, restoring from Hyper-V mod. When I say restoring from Hyper-V, not literally from Hyper-V, the backup is copied from Hyper-V in Veeam, and from Veeam, I'm restoring it in vSphere infrastructure, which is happening. And I'm also doing a restore in Azure, which is happening. We can see. So these two once done, then I'll move on to this one, how to protect the restored VM using the Veeam backup for Azure, a free edition, right? Okay, so it is 63% so far. And let's check the other one. Okay, this one is almost there, 1.7, another 500 gig or so to copy, and then this restore also will be done. So let me pause this video. If not, this will be a very lengthy video. I'll pause and I'll get back. Okay, so I just wanted to record this last section of the vSphere move to production process, right? Because as you can see, as soon as we trigger that migrate to production option where we are moving the restored instant recovery VM from your Veeam to the actual vSAN data store, it does a storage vMotion in the backend. So as soon as it's done, it will go and close the session for the instant recovery. So I just wanted to show that if usually Veeam does it automatically. If not, we can also go and stop the session. So the migration is almost done. It's 99 now, and it should be completed by now. So we can see in, yeah, it is completed and it's removing snapshot. So if you go back here in a while, yeah, this job is done. Job finished. All right, let's click on OK. To validate this, if you go here, if you go to summary, right now you're seeing Veeam. Just do a refresh. We can see now the VM is back to the VM is moved to the vSAN data store, which is the actual data store meant to be moved. Right. So with this, we can say we completed the restore of VMware infrastructure, right? And you can see now the instant recovery tab is already gone because it already finished the restore. Now going back to Azure, yes, I think the Azure, the performing conversion, everything is done. Now it is in the place where it is trying to create a Azure VM, which means the backend job, whatever has to be done to restore, it is completed. So how do we check that? Let me go back to my Azure. If I go to my account and I click on the subscription, okay, you can see here, right? So I have Windows XP Azure Restored, which is in creating process. Okay, so which means the Veeam as triggered to create, which is almost done. I see it's done. Creating VM is done, conversion is completed, and then restore is completed successfully, right? So it's so great, right? I mean, a VM from Hyper-V, you're restoring in vCenter, your VMware infrastructure, and you're also restoring it in Azure. And you used it, backup repository called Scale-out Backup Repository, where there is one local copy and one is tiered to cloud. So the restore is so quick, right? Um, yeah, so now next, what I will be doing is, since we already saw, let's see, yeah. So the restore is completed here. We can just refresh it. And the VM is in the running state. Okay. Now, the next thing you can see here, right? Veeam Free Edition VM. Now, in typical scenario, when there is an production down situation, we restore a VM elsewhere and we start working on it. When we work, there is a data change. And how do we protect this VM? So that's the scenario, what we are doing. So imagine there was an Hyper-V where Windows XP was running. For some reason, the production went down. I restored it in Azure. Now in Azure, users started accessing the application. They started working on it and they're making changes. But I need to protect these changes also. What if something happens to Azure and all the changes are gone? So you can just search for this option called Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, right? So you see from marketplace, there is like free edition available. So I've used this free edition. So you just need to click on create. It'll ask the basic information. What is your resource group? What's your VNet? Where you want to place it, which I've already done because it takes some time, right? So I've deployed the VM. It's a Linux VM, as you can see. It's a Linux VM from Veeam. It's not from Microsoft. This is from Microsoft's marketplace, but it is owned by Veeam. So it's installed here, and it will give you a public IP. So we can use this public IP address from here, and just put it in your browser. So this will open up the Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure, the free edition. And here I can quickly go and create a backup job to back up the restored VM. So I can backup virtual machine, I can backup SQL Server, I can backup Azure files as well. Maybe in future they will add other things. But for now, I just focus on the virtual machine backup. So I will say WinXP backup Azure restore. So basically, I'm just creating a backup job. This is similar to your on-prem, just little bit changes like which account. So just choose your Microsoft account and which region. So based out of Singapore. So I just go to Southeast Asia. I pick this, apply, and then what resource you want to protect. I want to protect virtual machines. So I just go and do a rescan. I can see my Windows XP is here. I add that to be protected, apply, next. And if you want to go through this, we can, but I'm just keeping it simple for the demo purpose. I'm not doing any customization, anything, just a simple one. And this is kind of an on-demand. I can also enable like when I want to back up all those things, but I'm just keeping it a simple one, like a on-demand backup, right? So next, you can see the summary, finish. So there will be one backup job triggered. So this one is going to take some time. Is it started? Okay, I have to start it. Sorry. Yeah. All right. So this is in running state right now. This will take some time to do the backup. So basically, I am backing up Azure restored VM, which we did using a Veeam free edition from Azure Marketplace. And this is the UI for that. And I've configured a simple policy. This one is a very simple UI. So it just shows what's happening in your infrastructure, what is getting protected. For example, this one, and data protected. If you go, and then the policy, this is where I created a policy which is running right now. So it is protecting this instance, and right now there is a snapshot policy which is running. So it will take some time. Maybe we look into the other things right now. So let's go back to our diagram. Okay. Now step one, step zero, step one is done. Step two, restore is done. And then we also use the free edition from Microsoft to protect the VM, which is in progress. Now the last step is I will be doing a restore in AWS cloud, right? Now for this, again, let's go back to the logic, right? I can do a restore from the Azure Blob storage, which has a copy of Windows XP, or I can use the local backup. Now, if you ask me, right, I will definitely use the local backup for this demo purpose, because when I do a restore from Azure Blob storage to AWS, there will be an egress for Azure. It will be an egress, which means my data is leaving my Azure cloud. But for AWS, it's an ingress, which means data is going. So there is no cost for going. But then since my data is going out of Azure, I will be charged for the bandwidth. So I don't want to do that. Instead, I will go to Veeam and I use the local option here, and I go to restore to Amazon EC2, and I'll tell you this will fail because Amazon EC2 does not support Windows XP. But for this demo, I just wanted to pick this. I'll just go through the steps and I'll show you it will fail. So adding an AWS account, everything is a very simple step. We can do it, and the region is global, definitely not government cloud or China. And the region here, I select Singapore, next. And yeah, here you can change the VM name just like how we did. So I just call it as AWS restore and then go next. And here I can choose the size of the VM just like how we did in Azure. And T2 Micro, as you know, in AWS, it's free. I am using a free account. So I just go for my T2 Micro instance and the license, bring your own license. Okay, next. And here we need to say same like how we selected the VNet here, VPC. This is my VPC, this is my subnet default, no public address. Next. Again, the scan option. Next. Next. and finish. Okay, so usually when we were finishing previously, right, when I was exploring this, you would also get it in your lab if you're trying. You will get this error message when you're trying to restore in EC2 instance, like the fail to validate VM, no suitable image found. This is kind of a, it's not a bug, but then you can see there is some default Windows list Veeam attempts to reference that was recently modified by AWS. So when the product version 12 was launched, it had its own repository of AWS images. And if AWS changed that, we have to incorporate that changes in the Veeam, right? So we just need to create some registry, which I did. It works perfectly fine. Just copy this and run it in a PowerShell script, and it creates some registry entry to fix that issue like this, which I did, and I could, overcome that issue. Right now, this will take some time. As I said, it's definitely going to fail, right? But the process, I just wanted to show you like how to restore it in EC2 as well. So far it is looking good. It will also try to move it to EC2. Then later, once it's trying to create the VM, right? It would say Windows XP is not supported by Amazon. So that's okay. At least we know like what we are trying to do. The focus was here not more on the application level, like what the VM has or anything, but this one was more to show the multi-cloud mobility of Veeam, like from Hyper-V to VMware, VMware to Azure, Azure to EC2. I can also go and do it in Google Cloud or Nutanix AHV. So it's pretty portable. As you see, the demo, which is live, has gone so seamlessly well. If we really plan around restoring the production application, we also need to consider the firewalls and other stuff before we restore and start using, because it will be exposed to public, right? So those all are the other consideration, and you also need to consider the charges on cloud and everything. So with this, I would conclude my presentation. Let's go back and just check one thing, which is the backup on cloud, which I triggered. It is still running. Yeah, so this also takes some time for the first time to be done. So it is basically the backup free version which I'm using on Azure Marketplace is taking the backup of the restored machine. All right, guys. So to summarize, there is quite a few things which we did today, right? So we kind of saw what is Veeam Scale-out Backup Repository and how to take a backup from Hyper-V, how we restored in vCenter using instant recovery first and then move to production option. And we restored it to the Azure Blob. And while restoring it to Azure, we basically considered which option is better from capacity or Azure. And similarly, when we are restoring it in EC2, we were checking what will be the egress cost and everything. So with all these things, I will conclude my call, and thank you everyone for listening so long. Thanks.